For those of you guys who don't know, just an introductory point to this video. So this is a video, and I think Cameron will explain it in the intro, in his intro. But Bart Ehrman was on Cosmic Skeptic. Now, I should say I haven't seen that interview. I'm planning on watching that interview. And then William Lane Craig is responding to that interview. They've selected some clips and then they're responding to it. So I'm sort of responding to a response video. Both of the links to both the Capturing Christianity one and the one from Alex O'Connor will be there. I just realized. Oh. And yeah, so you guys can go and watch all of that. So drop a comment, tell us how you're doing, what's going on. I'm not going to speed this video up. This video is not a sped up video. The reason why this video is not sped up is because when they're responding to the clips from Bart Ehrman, Cameron has sped that up. If I were to speed this video up, those videos will get sped up. Now, again, I can speed their talking up and then slow it down. I just don't want to do that. So I just decided not to speed it up.
Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. Today I've got Dr. William Lane Craig with me. We're responding to an interview between Dr. Bart Ehrman and Alex O'Connor. He actually recently changed his name from Cosmic Skeptic to just his real name, Alex O'Connor, which I think was actually a really smart move. But I've got Dr. William Lane Craig with me on to respond to the section of that interview where they interacted directly with the work of Dr. William Lane Craig. I am extremely excited about today's interview. I was just talking with my wife before we went live today that it's been a while since I've been this excited about doing an interview on Capturing Christianity. We have, I think, 9 total clips pulled up to play for you guys. This is really exciting, and we wanted to say, at least at the beginning of this, some nice things about the interview. At least about Alex. So, Dr. Craig, go ahead and take it away. Say what you wanted to say about Alex before we look at some of these
Thank
clips.
you, Cameron, for having me on your program today. I have to say I'm thrilled to hear that Alex O'Connor has switched his handle and gotten rid of the Cosmic Skeptic. I encouraged him to do that. And I thought it was...
I should say that his handle is still Cosmic Skeptic. His channel is called Alex O'Connor, but his handle to tag him in videos is still Cosmic Skeptic, so... Alex.
It was just remarkable how this young man, who is not yet a Christian believer, was able to press Bart Ehrman so hard in presenting the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. The audience might not realize it from Bart's calm and confident manner that at several points in this interview, O'Connor really has Ehrman's back to the wall. And Ehrman has to wriggle to escape. So well done, Alex. I was impressed.
Yeah, Alex did a really... I was equally impressed with Alex. But on the flip side, as I was listening to Bart, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do a sort of response video with Dr. Craig on this, is I was listening to Dr. Ehrman's responses. I just remember thinking, man, this is just not very good. Like, these responses just didn't really strike me. Like, and this wasn't like apologetics Cameron, like trying to just like come up with some reason why Christianity is true. This was just really honestly like listening to what he was saying and just being like, man, that's not it. That's not it, Chief. No. But like I said, I'm really excited to get into some of the actual meat of their conversation. So I think it starts at around the hour mark is when they start to talk about some of the work of Dr. Craig. And as I mentioned, we've got about 9 clips total that we'll get through, 8 clips from the interview, and then 1 other clip from another video, which we'll see which one that's from. But unless, Dr. Craig, you've got anything else you want to say at the beginning of this, let's go ahead and get into the first clip and just do as much damage as we can. So let's, here's the first clip. Oh, before we get to the clips, one quick note on the clips. So since we have so many clips and so much stuff to get through, I actually sped them up. This is the first time I've ever done this on stream. I normally listen to YouTube at like 1.5 to 2 times speed anyways. So It's normal for me to speed up clips and like listen to things fast. So it's not going to catch me off guard, like if I'm listening back to this. But just know that we did speed these clips up to 1.5 times speed. Okay. So it's going to sound sped up. It's going to sound a little bit weird, but we did that so that we could save time. So just quick note on that. All right, here we go. Here's clip number 1.
I had an episode with William Lane Craig, and he put forward a historical case for the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And I remember in that podcast, I sort of listening back had wished that I pushed back a little more. And a lot of people actually noticed, and they said, I'm surprised that you didn't really give him a bit more grief for it. Yeah. But I figured that perhaps rather than making a botched attempt at doing it myself, it'd be better to ask you. I mean, his view on the matter, along with many others, is that we have a few facts about Jesus that we can pretty confidently say are true. Firstly, that a man called Jesus existed and was sort of going around teaching an ethical code of sorts and gaining followers, got into disrepute with the Roman authorities, was killed by crucifixion, and that afterwards groups of people claim to have seen him. Do you think that all of these facts are sort of well established?
Yes.
So given that, how do we explain the fact that all of these are true at the same time?
Oh, well, I don't see any trouble at all. We have other figures in history for whom we have things like that, with those 4 facts. I mean, Romulus, the founder of Rome, I don't know if he was a historical figure or not, but people thought he was, and he certainly ended up somehow leaving the earth, and people, there were eyewitnesses saying that they saw him alive afterwards.
Good. I mean, do we have sort of, firstly, are the sources as reliable? Are they as well attested? Do we
now that's another question. See, that's not one of your 4 things.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm asking about is when we say that these facts are well established.
Well, Livy, the historian Livy, so he's a Roman historian, and he reports that. Or Apollonius of Tyana. We have eyewitness testimony to his being raised from the dead.
Okay, so this first clip, just to quickly sort of summarize, so he says that Craig's 4 facts, well, these 4 facts are about Jesus, but they're easy to explain. Okay, and then we also have like testimony from Romulus and Apollonius, who they report these sort of similar like miracle claims and stuff, but we don't really believe those. And so these things can just be sort of easily explained away. So what is your response to this, Dr. Craig?
Well, first, I want to point out that Alex has got the 4 facts wrong that I appealed to for inferring the resurrection of Jesus. The facts that I appeal to are, first of all, that after his crucifixion, Jesus was interred in a tomb late on Friday afternoon by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. Secondly, that on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was discovered to be empty by a group of his female followers. Thirdly, thereafter, various individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. And finally, number 4, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite every predisposition to the contrary. And those 4 facts are widely agreed upon by the majority of New Testament historians today and supply an inductive basis for inferring to the resurrection of Jesus. So those are the facts that I'm staking my claim on, not the facts mentioned by Alex. Now, Ehrman's response to this is really puzzling. He agrees that the facts mentioned by Alex are historical facts. He admits that. But he says these are easily explained. Why? Well, because similar facts are attested by other figures in antiquity, like Romulus and Apollonius. Now, on the face of this is bizarre. Suppose someone were to say, how do you explain the facts of the assassination of John F. Kennedy? And you were to reply, oh, that's easy to explain. President Lincoln and President McKinley were also assassinated. Those events wouldn't do anything to explain the facts of the assassination of JFK. Moreover, those 2 individuals are historical persons, right? But in the case of Romulus and Apollonius, we're dealing here with mythological and quasi-fictional persons. Romulus is the figure in the myth of the founding of Rome who supposedly founded the city about 750 BC. Ehrman himself, you notice, says, I don't even know if he was a historical figure or not. The first account of the founding of Rome by Romulus is from the 3rd century BC, so hundreds of years later after this supposed event. Apollonius of Tyana was a 1st century philosopher and magician, a kind of shadowy figure. Well, over 100 years after his death, the Roman Empress Julia commissioned the writer Philostratus to write a sort of romance novel of the life of Apollonius of Tyana. And so most of this is just fiction made up by Philostratus. And it is interesting that Philostratus was commissioned to do this by the empress because she wanted to have a counterweight to the surging Christian movement in the early Roman Empire, and so wanted to create a kind of divine man figure to compete with Christianity. And so it's likely that Apollonius actually knew and used, or not Apollonius, Philostratus actually knew and used the Gospels in writing his life of Apollonius. John Alsop has written a authoritative book on the post-resurrection appearances in the gospel tradition. And here's what Alsop says. He says, it is very probable, in light of the chronological and biological factors, that Philostratus, in one sense or another, is dependent upon the gospel accounts, especially the Gospel of Luke, and maybe upon the Emmaus story. So these are in no sense comparable to the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus, which were written down within the century of the eyewitnesses, within the generation of the eyewitnesses.
The only thing that I was going to say in response to this first clip is that, yeah, these were not the 4 facts that you mentioned: the crucifixion, the empty tomb, the appearances, and then the origin of belief. Like those are the 4 that you normally appeal to, and that those are way more difficult to explain than the ones that Alex mentioned in the clip there. And so I think, though, if Alex mentioned those, then Bart would have, because he balks later on. Well, we'll get to that clip when he talks about the empty tomb. So if he would have mentioned the empty tomb here, he would have mentioned what he's going to mention later on. But yeah, that was the only thing that I would have added there. You know what?
By the way, guys, I'm letting this run because I don't like just chopping it. So if, again, I treat these kind of reaction videos as though we were sitting together in a room and watching it together, and then we'd go through a section or a segment and then be able to stop it and say, hey, let's talk about this. That's essentially the heart behind this.
I wanted to say this. So there's a friend of mine whom you know, a mutual friend of ours, Cesar Bernstein. Does that ring a bell?
Oh, indeed. I didn't know you knew him.
He and I are friends. He actually was the one who recommended we do this show together. He watched the interview on Bart Ehrman on Alex's channel, and he was like, you know what, you should have Dr. Craig on and have him respond to this. And I was like, you know what, that's a good idea. Let me reach out to him and see if he's interested.
Wow.
And he says hello.
He has done excellent work on the ontological argument for God's existence. Really provocative.
Yeah, he's defended the possibility premise, and super interesting stuff. But I just wanted to, he sent me a text and said, say hi for me. So
thank you.
So there you go. All right, let's get into clip number 2, where we talk about how William Lane Craig adds other facts.
So just in regards to, I guess, the claim that, hey, this is a historical person or whatever like that, and then, let me back up. I'm trying to be as objective as possible here. The idea that there are claims made about Jesus in the Gospels, and then countering that by saying, here is these 2 guys that there are statements made about them. the most you can go with that, in my opinion, if you're Bart Ehrman, the most you can go is this is in the literature of sorts. And then make a case for that. Like, hey, this is the sort of literature the Bible is. And so I'm not taking it as historically accurate. I'm not taking it the way you're taking it, Dr. Craig. I'm taking it within the genre of these things about Apollonius and Romulus. But he would have to defend against the claim. Apollonius is post. Okay. Apollonius is post New Testament. It could have borrowed as trying to be a counter to Christianity. So it's the reverse. Like they're stealing from the Christians. In regards to Romulus, then you get one historian, it seems like, and it's 400 years after the fact, as opposed to the gospel authors are much closer to the actual events, and then there's a lot more of it. So those conversations would need to be had. That's just making a claim, and I think this is where Craig was going with this, just making a claim that, like he gave the example of John F. Kennedy being assassinated, and it's like, yeah, but so were these guys. Yeah, and then what?
Here we go. Clip number 2.
Oh, no, but see, now you're getting into other facts. See,
Yes.
So the question is, what are facts? So if you're just talking about those 4 elements, then we certainly have those 4 elements. So they're not difficult to explain. What William Lane Craig wants to do, though, is to take those 4 facts and start adding others to them as if they were the same value.
What other facts are we talking about here? Like,
Well, he says that we know that there was an empty tomb.
and you don't think that that's the case?
I don't know.
And one of the things that I think Dr. Craig might say on that point is that if people were claiming to have seen him, if people were claiming that this man had risen from the dead, the tomb was there. It was something people could have gone to check. And it would have probably been one of the first things that they did upon hearing that this Jesus figure had risen from the dead. If there were no empty tomb, surely someone would have discovered this. This is not good evidence confirming the idea that there was, in fact, an empty
Well, it
tomb.
presupposes that he was buried in a tomb.
This is one of the facts that William Lane Craig thinks we can say is well established, that he was buried.
So did you guys catch that? He's supposing that he was buried in a tomb. So essentially he's saying the gospel authors that are saying that Jesus buried in a tomb essentially are wrong about it. He wasn't buried in a tomb. And that's the direction that we're going to go into, whether he was or wasn't.
In a tomb, that's important to him. You don't think so?
No, I know. I mean, that's the thing. He takes these 4 things that, basically everybody would agree on. There's a man, Jesus, got killed, and later people said they saw him alive. So that's fine. I mean, those 4 are easily explained. Was there an empty tomb? There are very big problems with thinking there was a tomb at all. He's presupposing that the gospel story is right, that Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus the afternoon he was crucified and put him in a family tomb, and on the 3rd day, women came and found the tomb empty. Okay, so what is our evidence of it? Well, the evidence, of course, is only in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they say that. And it was the tradition the Christians had had for a very long time. So it's certainly the Christian tradition. But there are lots of reasons for doubting that it's right, that he's never taken very seriously.
So, Dr. Craig, there are reasons for doubting the burial account that you don't take seriously. What is your response to this?
What must not be missed here is the concession that Bart Ehrman makes to Alex O'Connor. Ehrman concedes that if the burial narrative is historically reliable, then it becomes extremely difficult to deny the historicity of the empty tomb. Because if the burial story is accurate, that implies that the site of Jesus' grave was known to Jew and Christian alike in Jerusalem. And therefore, when the disciples began to preach the resurrection of Jesus, that tomb had to be empty in order for belief in the resurrection of a dead man to originate and flourish in the very city where he was publicly crucified and his tomb was known. So that means that Ehrman is in the very difficult position of having to disprove the burial account. The person who believes in the empty tomb doesn't need to prove the burial story. He can have other reasons in support of the empty tomb account. But the burial account is the sine qua non of the empty tomb story. If you're going to deny the empty tomb, then you've got to disprove the burial account. Well, we've got good reasons to believe that the burial account is reliable. We have at least 5 independent sources in support of the burial account. Moreover, the burial of Jesus by a member of the Sanhedrin, rather than by his beloved disciples or by his family, is unexpected and therefore very unlikely to have been a fictional or legendary creation in the early Christian community. And therefore, the vast majority of scholars, virtually all New Testament scholars, agree that the burial story of Jesus' corpse in the tomb by Joseph is historical. Now, Ehrman asserts that there are lots of reasons to doubt that Jesus was buried, but you notice he never says what they are. Instead, he immediately changes the subject. So if Ehrman is going to disagree with the almost unanimous opinion of New Testament scholarship that the burial account is credible, then he needs to give us what these overwhelming reasons are.
Yeah, true. And then he asked, what is our evidence of the empty tomb? I suppose we can get to that in a second.
So I've heard Bart Ehrman speak about this before, and I've heard others speak about this, and specifically the conversation has to do with, hey, here's a record that we have of individuals who were crucified by the Romans in those days, and based on that, we know they weren't buried. They were just left on crosses and stuff like that. That's the evidence. But it seems to me that's an argument from silence of sorts. Okay? Because if correct, by the way, that's factual, that people were left on crosses for embarrassment. People were sometimes crucified when they were dead already. But that doesn't mean that in this situation they wouldn't have taken his body down.
I did want to bring something up really quickly.
Well,
so
I did mention two facts, Cameron, that namely it has multiple independent attestation in at least five different sources.
Independent
and that's
sources.
one of the most important evidences for historicity. And then also the unlikelihood of a burial of Jesus by a Sanhedrist, a member of the very council that had condemned Jesus.
Yeah, I suppose if you're making something up, the argument should be made, if you're making something up, why name a guy? Why name an actual guy that buried the body, and instead of saying something like, hey, some of us went and buried his body? Again, remember, you're functioning off of the premise that they're making this story up. And whenever you're making a story up, you would want it to be general enough so people can pin it down. You name an individual, you speak about where he was, his family tomb, X, Y, and Z. Like, what's the point? Why bring this guy into story? It seems like such an unnecessary fact or unnecessary support or unnecessary involvement in the story by this guy named Joseph. Right? So let me just address some of the comments that are coming in because they're important. The Romans never buried people after they were crucified. The Romans didn't bury Jesus. If it was left to the Romans would have just let him remain on the cross. Remember that. It's not the Romans who buried Jesus. It's Joseph of Arimathea. So that argument, it's like, correct, the Romans didn't do it. And they would not have done it. So it's very important, like, we got to be fair here, guys. In our conversations, we want to, our whatever, accusations and responses. The Romans did not bury Jesus.
So I did also want to mention, in addition to that, we've got an article on Capturing Christianity that was written by what is now an anonymous author, but it's outlining 9 reasons why Joseph of Arimathea was a real historical figure. So if you go to capturingchristianity.com, type in Joseph of Arimathea, you can find this article very quickly. It outlines 9 different reasons. We're not going to go through all of these reasons right now, but you can kind of see them. If you want to, you can pause the video and kind of look at them here, or you can just go to the website and read through them. But here are 9 reasons. This is based on actually a book. This is a book review of Jesus in Jerusalem, the Last Days. So go check that out. We've also got an article on our website that is entitled 8 Strong Arguments for the Empty Tomb, which is based on actually the book The Sun Rises by Dr. William Lane Craig, the guy who I've got here with me today. And he outlines on page, I had the page pulled up, maybe I don't have it anymore, but when you start to talk about the empty tomb, you give, I think, 7 or 8 lines of evidence for the burial narratives. But one thing, or I guess a couple things that I wanted to ask you about, some additional lines of evidence that you haven't really mentioned here, but you mentioned in your written work, is what about the Shroud of Turin? Do you think the Shroud of, is it Turin or Turin?
Turin, or in Italian, Torino.
Okay.
But I don't.
Do you think that provides any evidence for the burial account?
Until the authenticity of the shroud is proved, I don't think it's wise to appeal to it. It certainly is a stunning artifact. No one knows how to explain the image of the man on the shroud. But until those carbon dating tests that showed it to be medieval are decisively reversed, I think it has a question mark behind it.
So how about this? Would you support the conditional, if the Shroud of Turin were authentic, then the burial account would be accurate, or something along those lines?
Yes, I think that it strongly supports the burial account that we have in the Gospels.
If it were authentic, so it depends on the probability that you think that the shroud is authentic. So for people who do think that the shroud is authentic, then it would lend incredible support for a burial account. So this would be good archaeological evidence, apart from any sort of like biblical or written evidence or oral evidence.
You can't get more tangible physical evidence than something like the shroud.
So what about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Because you've talked about that in your Defenders.
Why Ehrman didn't mention that, because there is a very plausible historical claim that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem does in fact stand on the site of Jesus' tomb. We could go into that if you want, but I don't know if we have time.
No, we don't have to go into any details. I just wanted to see if you think that it does, and then we can point people to go check it out for more if they'd like to look into it further.
I think it has a very plausible claim to rest on the site of Jesus' burial.
Okay, so let's speak about some of the comments that are coming in here. Specifically, I think the discussion that is going on between Back to Orthodoxy and the American Cuban. So the question was, the Romans never buried people, so why would they do it in this sense, right? Justin says, Deuteronomy 21 to 22 states that Jews ought to take down executed criminals down from the poles or crosses, whatever the death method would have been, and bury them and not defile the last Jew would have, and not defile. The last Jews would have wanted that. Why would the Romans allow Jews to bury one of the messiahs they crucified? Well, you got to realize that the Jews, generally speaking, didn't accept him as a messiah. It's a little pocket of people. The other thing is political maneuverings, dude. Favors. I mean, Joseph of Arimathea is a part of the political elite, and he goes and asks for a favor. Why not? Which is more likely, for a politician to go ask another politician for a favor and get that? Or kind of this argument from silence of saying, no, they would have never done that, even for a political friend. So Why would the Romans allow for it? Because of political connections. The other point, I think, scripturally speaking, is what Justin says here, because Pilate gave into the demands of the Sanhedrin to kill Jesus. Why wouldn't they allow them to fulfill the law, to bury him, or members of the Sanhedrin to go and bury him? I think those are fine points, by the way. Pilate couldn't care less about the Sanhedrin. The argument from silence. You know, absolutely. By the way, let me just push back here. I think you're just talking nonsense. In the very real sense of the word, Pilate would have cared a lot about what the Sanhedrin thought. These are political individuals that could make his life a lot harder or easier. So to say Pilate couldn't care less about the Sanhedrin would be the equivalent of saying something like, the president of the United States doesn't care about anything about what Congress says. That'd be an extremely foolish statement to make. Of course, the president of the United States cares about what Congress thinks and members of the Congress think. He has to work with them. Same case when it comes to... So again, we make these statements, guys, but how do you know? Again, if we want to think about probabilities, probability would be Pilate would have cared because politicians care about what other politicians think that they got to work with, rather than, no, he wouldn't have cared. It's by the way, it's not a custom. It's not like they didn't do it, but there was nothing in the law that they shouldn't do it. You got to give alternatives here, by the way. Pilate wouldn't have cared is not an argument. That's like, good job. You have opinions. The Sanhedrin were Jews who were the ruling politicians over all the legal affairs for all Jews that were under the Roman government. I hope everybody knows that. It's not necessarily an argument, Keanu. It is a response to a comment. So again, if the claim is that they're coming up with a lie, then cool. You have to address the fact of them coming up with a lie by mentioning this guy Joseph, who's a member of the Sanhedrin, who now you've created extra stuff that you got to run through if you're lying and making a story up. Just make a story up without mentioning those people. Mention yourself. There's easier lies to tell, is the argument.
Okay. All right. Yeah, fair enough. All right, let's move on to clip number 3, where Ehrman has
I forgot to say anything about the evidence for the empty tomb. I talked about the burial, but let me just run through a few evidences for the empty tomb. Namely, wholly apart from the burial account and its credibility, there are at least 6 independent sources for the empty tomb, some of which are among the earliest source materials in the New Testament, such as the pre-Markan Passion story. Secondly, the Markan account of the discovery of the empty tomb lacks signs of legendary embellishment or theological reflection that you would expect to find in a later legendary account. Thirdly, the tomb was probably discovered empty by women. Any conceivable motivation for having women be the discoverers of the empty tomb would have been better met by having male disciples discover the tomb, given the low status of women in a patriarchal culture and their inability to serve as credible witnesses. And then finally,
So, by the way, the women finding the tomb is, I think, is strong. And if people don't understand and accept that it's strong, they don't understand the culture. Hey, American Cuban, you're overly simplistic on the way you're thinking about this, in my opinion. And how do I say this without being offensive? I'm not trying to be offensive. It seems to me that you just like don't know how politics works. Pilate was specifically sent to Jerusalem because they had riots on their hands regularly. Even though it might have been in his power to replace people randomly, it would have probably been a very stupid idea politically. So just because you have the power to do stuff doesn't mean you will do it. And even if you're working with people if they work under you, doesn't mean they can't cause trouble. Like, that's just not the way politics works. It's like, oh yeah, we have authority over them. If they say anything, we can just kill them all. And then you do kill them all. And then you have riots on your hand and their followers going crazy and burning your palace down. Like, do you want that on your hands? Probably not. And the New Testament actually attests to this as to why Pilate gives in for their request to kill Jesus. And it's because he doesn't want a riot on his hands. Jesus' followers are not as large as Jesus' opponents. And so therefore he gives in to Jesus' opponents because, hey, risk benefit analysis. Pilate indeed cared about the Jewish leaders, as it was Pilate who grudgingly had Jesus crucified due to their traditions and allowed the Barabbas to go free. The religious Jewish leaders called for it. Correct. Yeah, and it's just like it's an opinion. That's all it is. Like, oh, he didn't care about them. Like, that's just not true. You would be a foolish leader, not you personally, but if I were Pilate and I got called to go to Jerusalem, and the reason why I went there is because it's a chaotic place and it needs to be kind of controlled if I'm Roman. I don't go there saying I don't care what about anyone says, especially your leaders. You go there making compromises. You have an ability, you're a shrewd politician to establish some sort of a peace. The worst thing you can possibly do is go there and say, hey, you guys, I know the people respect you. You're the entire religious leadership of this community. I don't care about what you say. Like, that just does not happen. Think about any American president who gets elected president, and the State of the Union, maybe with the exception of Donald Trump, even he tried to do this, but the State of the Union generally is a speech where, not the State of the Union, the speech that why am I forgetting this? The speech that the president gives, the inauguration speech. Generally a unifying speech. Hey, he's the president of all America. You don't get up there and say, oh, by the way, half of Congress, you guys are morons. I don't care about what you think. That's not how politics works. And I would say probability in regards to this sort of an argument is on my side 95%. Human experience, how politics works, all of it. It's definitely not, he didn't care about what they said or what they thought or whatever.
For the earliest Jewish polemic presupposes that the tomb was empty. The earliest Jewish polemic, which I think goes right back to early Jewish Christian disputes in Jerusalem, was that the tomb the body of Jesus was stolen by the disciples.
Yeah.
Now, think about that for a minute. The disciples stole the body. That Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection presupposes that the body was in fact missing. It presupposes the historicity of the empty tomb. So rather than point to an occupied, closed tomb, all the Jewish authorities could do was enmesh themselves in this absurd debate about the disciples stealing the body. And so for reasons like these, again, I want to say that the wide majority of New Testament historians today do agree that, in fact, the tomb of Jesus was found empty on early Sunday morning by a group of Jesus women followers.
I think also what we're going to see in some of the future clips is some of the reasoning that Ehrman has used that's led him to reject the burial account, the empty tomb and stuff. Especially in this next clip, we're going to see some of this Humean reasoning start to that sort of seeped in to his reasoning, and we're going to highlight that and sort of highlight what's wrong with it.
What is ironic about this is that Ehrman himself, in his lectures on the historical Jesus with the teaching company, actually affirms the historicity of the burial and empty tomb. This is what he says, if I can quote.
This is good.
He says, with respect to Jesus' burial and empty tomb, the earliest accounts we have are unanimous in saying that Jesus was in fact buried by this fellow, Joseph of Arimathea. And so it's relatively reliable that that's what happened. We also have solid traditions to indicate that women found this tomb empty 3 days later. So that's what Ehrman used to teach about the historicity of the burial and the empty tomb of Jesus. And I think it was only after he saw where this was leading that he began to backpedal then and tried to deny the burial and empty tomb stories.
Hey, that's some solid reasoning there. I mean, to quote your opponent and say, hey, you used to believe this. I mean, if he's changed his mind, he's got to come out there and say he's changed his mind. He doesn't think this stuff is historically the case, but he used to. Then there's a question to ask as to why he has done that. Is it because of the evidence, or is it because of what William Lane Craig is saying? Which is, he knows where that kind of reasoning is leading to. He knows what that kind of argumentation leads to. And therefore, he's given that up. Which one is it?
All right, let's get to clip number 3, where Ehrman has a Humean understanding.
Somebody last week was interviewing me and replaying some things where he was trashing me for some debate we had 20 years ago, where he said that, the only reason I reject resurrection is because I've got some kind of warmed over Humean understanding of things, and I've never read Hume. It's like, it is just so wrong. It's just like, it's just factually wrong. But apart from that, he says that I'm not a historian. I don't know what he thinks. I do know what he thinks I am. He thinks that I'm a textual critic, whatever he thinks that is. And that's just completely wrong too. It's just like he knows nothing about me, but he's making stuff up.
So these are more personal conversations, right? It has nothing to do with that, but it has to do with like Humean philosophy, and then it has to do with whether Bart Ehrman is actually a historian or not. I'm going to look something up right now. So Bart Ehrman's website, I just went there just for the heck of it. Professor Ehrman completed his MDiv and PhD. What just happened? Okay. It says Professor Ehrman completed his MDiv and PhD degrees in Princeton Seminary, where in 1985 doctoral dissertation was awarded magna cum laude. An expert on the New Testament and the history of early Christianity, has written and edited. So if this means Again, by the way, no, like, could be a historian. That's not what I'm going after, but I think Craig's going to respond to that. Just putting that out there. This is more of a personal kind of jab they're taking at one another.
Okay, so yeah, you're factually wrong. You say he's not a historian. You know nothing about him, and you're making stuff up.
Yeah, what is a textual critic? A textual critic is someone who is an expert in reconstructing the original text of the New Testament. He compares manuscript evidence and on that basis reconstructs what the original reading of the text in the New Testament was. He's not a historian, he's a textual scholar. And that's what Bart Ehrman was trained in. Now, don't take my word for it. Get the Wikipedia article on Bart Ehrman and read it. And there you will read that Bart Ehrman earned his BA from Wheaton College. He then earned a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. And then finally, he took a PhD where, and I quote, he studied textual criticism of the Bible, development of the New Testament canon, and New Testament Apocrypha under the great textual critic Bruce Metzger, and worked with Metzger in establishing the critical edition of the Greek New Testament. And so here are the titles of Ehrman's scholarly works: Didymus the Blind and the Text of the Gospels, the text of the fourth gospel in the writings of Origen, the orthodox corruption of Scripture, the effect of early Christological controversies on the text of the New Testament, the text of the New Testament in contemporary research, the text of the New Testament, its transmission, corruption, and restoration, studies in the textual criticism of the New Testament. So I'm just baffled that Bart Ehrman would want to walk away from his fine work in textual criticism and his expertise in that area. But the fact is that when he claims to be a historian, this is mere posturing. He has no training or degree in history. He's a textual scholar, and in his popular level books, he likes to posture as a historian. Now, what about the claim that he uses an argument against the resurrection and miracles from David Hume? Well, in a recent interview that I did with Kevin Harris, Ehrman repeats this same Humean sort of argument that was featured in this debate that he and I had 20 years ago. And I explained at that time why this argument is demonstrably fallacious. And what I was shocked to hear was Ehrman propounding the same line today, namely that a miracle is so improbable that it cannot be established to be probably historical. And that is a patently fallacious claim that derives from David Hume's essay of miracles in the mid-18th century.
But what's weird is that he says that you're factually wrong about this. It seems like he's saying that he doesn't have a Humean understanding. He's not coming from Hume. He's not giving a Humean argument. However, like you said, he just gave one. Let's actually play the clip. I've got the clip pulled up. Let's play the clip from this interview with Apologia, and let's hear him for himself, like his own words.
The question is, if you've got reports of something, how do you evaluate its probability? Historians can only establish probability. That's all historians can do. And so if you have an event such as Romulus ascending to heaven, which after Romulus allegedly ascended to heaven, there was a senator who came forward and said that Romulus had come down to him and talked to him and told him and explained it to him, and he saw Romulus afterwards. Okay, so that's a historical report. So if you get that as the historical report, you have to ask, did it happen or not? Now, you don't say, well, it couldn't happen because nobody's ever done that. That isn't what you don't say it couldn't have happened because of that. You say, okay, what are our options for explaining why somebody told that story? So somebody will say, well, it's somebody who wanted the Roman people to think that Romulus had become a divine being, which they did, as the god Quirinus. Or you could say that it was a senator who wanted to hide up the fact that the senators actually had killed Romulus and hidden his body. Or you could say, you come up with your list of explanations. Okay, these are the possible explanations. Now, which one is more probable? Is it more probable that he ascended to heaven and became the god Quirinus? Or is it more probable that the senators who hated him killed him? Which is more probable? It's not that it's a unique fact. I mean, it's going to be unique either way. The question is which is more probable, and this is where his warmed over Hume comes in, which it comes in for him as well, because he uses it with Romulus. It's more likely that people who do this kind of thing all the time did this kind of thing in this case, than that he did something that's like so spectacular, it's like it's never happened before or since. That makes it more likely. So it's not the singularity.
So he literally says that he does it, but then he also says that you do it too. So he's not denying that he does this sort of reasoning. He's saying that you do it too.
And how do I do it too?
Well, he's saying that I think he's saying that like everyone does it. So like when it comes to Romulus, everyone just denies that he was this miracle worker that ascended to heaven or anything like that. So
Well,
I think that
okay,
I think he's saying like everyone, when they approach that story, they become a little warmed over Hume.
He's confused here between the facticity of the Romulus story and the.
Did y'all know that facticity is a word? Did you guys know that facticity is a word? Use it next time at a dinner party. Just be like, I was thinking about the facticity of President Biden's recent decisions. Might get you a date. Not guaranteed, but it might get you a date.
Best explanation for some purported historical fact. As I pointed out at the beginning of this podcast, the stories of Romulus and Apollonius of Tyana are mythical and quasi-fictional, so there's nothing to be explained.
The response I would have here is that, you don't want to talk past each other. So I would say, Dr. Craig, but Bart Ehrman thinks the New Testament literature about Jesus is actually this quasi-mythical stuff as well. So the conversation isn't necessarily whether this should be trusted as opposed to this, I guess, is to make an argument as to why the New Testament isn't quasi-fictional as opposed to why those things are quasi-fictional.
Contrast, we have good historical evidence for such things as the burial, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and the origin of the Christian faith. And so given those facts, the question now becomes, what is the best explanation of them? And Ehrman's claim is that the supernatural explanation or miraculous explanation is always less probable than some natural.
So again, if that's the idea, then yes, you're coming at it with a predisposed philosophical worldview, say pro-naturalism or anti-supernaturalism or whatever the case may be, and then looking at those stories within that kind of a context, rather than coming to it and saying, well, yeah, these things are really possible. It's possible that somebody could rise from the dead. Or it's possible, but it's not probable. However you do it, I think that's where the conversation is. And then whether these things are actually quasi-fictional.
Realistic explanation. And that is demonstrably fallacious. That is Hume's argument, is that it's impossible to identify any event as a miracle.
And that was basically what he was saying with Apollonius just now in that clip. He's saying, we've got this pool, you come up with your pool of explanations that explain the data, and then you pick the one that is the most likely. But what he excludes is any explanation that is sort of miraculous or supernatural or anything like that. And so, and then he just applies the same standard to the resurrection, and this was kind of what Hume did, is like any testimony of the miraculous, like what is more likely, that it's a miracle or that the person who's giving the testimony was lying or mistaken or something like that.
Right.
And that's basically what Hume was arguing. Now, I do have a couple questions for you. You've mentioned in your work Hume's abject failure a couple times as a good resource for people that are interested in this question of David Hume and whether or not his arguments hold any water. But
yes,
I was wondering,
by the philosopher of science John Ehrman.
Yeah, not Ehrman, but Ehrman,
Right?
Or Ehrman. It's spelled Ehrman.
Right.
It was a really good book. I really enjoyed that one. But another book that I'm curious if you've read or heard about is called Hume, Holism and Miracles by David Johnson.
No, I don't know that book.
So this one is my favorite book that I've read on this particular subject, and I recommend to everyone to go pick this up. I actually got lucky, and I got this for like $10 on Amazon. It was on sale one day. But I enjoyed this one a lot because, well, A, it was shorter, but then B, he really shows how David Hume was just quite clearly begging the question. And so it was just a really, really good, succinct book on the problems of David Hume. So I just wanted to give a quick plug on that one.
I'm going to stop there and address some comments that have come in. Back to Justin says, do you think pointing out that someone doesn't have a degree in a respective field is an ad hominem? Not necessarily. It could be. It could be, depending on how it's being used, right? So I think it could be in the sense like, hey, you claimed to be this thing, and then you're not that thing because you don't have any degrees in that thing. This is just like one of those weird things that I think we as a society look up to, like, because you can have a degree in something and just be very bad at doing that thing. Just having a degree in it doesn't make you reputable. Also, you might not have a degree and have studied the subject a lot more closely than somebody else. So it really depends, but it could be an ad hominem. I don't think it's necessarily an ad hominem. Tico, one thing, by the way, could you please, I beg of you, because I read your comments under that other video. If you're going to send me stuff, like, you can email me. But if you don't want to email me, just the comments you're leaving, leave them under the appropriate videos, please. That's just a request. It's of me. So you were thinking about the facticity of a contradiction of a square circle. Well, my response to you is that what you're dealing with in those comments that you left me had actually to do with the philosophy of language more than logic. And you can still call something a square and then give it a different definition. Let's say you call something a square but give it the definition of a circle. Then that's just whatever you're calling that object. The name has changed. So this is not very complicated because we just think about it like in Armenian. Say if I said karakusi for square, it's the same definition, different words, but the item is still the same. So these are like Platonic universals and stuff like that because the definition of that thing is that. And so it's actually an argument in my favor instead of yours if you think about it deep enough, and then if you consider it actually. But I will not let you have logical contradictions. It's really, really bad reasoning. I suggest that you read some serious articles on this subject. Seriously. And by the way, the other example you gave had to do with being married in the United States and then going to Russia. And then because it's recognized in the US but not in Russia, so therefore you're a married bachelor. You realize that that scenario and that analogy just fails miserably because you're leaving a great part of information out to fit your qualifications of whatever that is. That would actually be epistemologically, that would be a serious case in which something is an incorrect justified. It wouldn't be justified, and it wouldn't be true. It would still be a belief, but somebody wouldn't claim knowledge on you going to Russia and then lying to people and telling them you're not married. But just to respond to that in a really quick fashion, moving on with our video.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to clip number 4. If I can find my mouse to scroll up in our notes here. This one is what happened to crucified victims. What did Romans do to the crucified victims? Here we go.
We do have a number of references to what Romans did once the person died
We were speaking about this earlier, so it's cool that we've come here.
on the crosses. And the accounts are consistent that what they did is they left them on the crosses as part of the humiliation.
Yes.
That they would decompose on the cross and be attacked by scavengers. And so we have off-the-cuff remarks in a number of sources that that's just what they did. And so there are debates about that. We can have debates about whether that happened within Judaism or not. People say, yeah, Jews didn't allow that. That's absolutely right. Jews didn't allow it. But the Jews weren't killing him. The Romans were killing him.
Yeah.
and so forth and so on. So
Okay, yeah. So multiple accounts say they left him on the cross. Jews wouldn't have allowed it, but Romans did it.
Right. So we're back to the question of the historicity of the burial narrative. And as I've already explained, by far and away, most scholars are convinced that in Jesus' case, the body was not left on the cross, but it was taken down and interred in a tomb. And I think, as Ehrman hints in his reply, you cannot let Roman practice outside of Judea indicate or dictate what they did in Judea. Pilate respected Jewish sensibilities in order to keep the peace. And the Jewish authorities would want the body taken down from the cross before nightfall, especially because of impending Passover, one of the holiest days, because the body left on the cross would defile the land. And so I think we have really good evidence that a Sanhedrist did assume responsibility for interring the body of Jesus in a tomb. And I would mention as well that we actually have archaeological evidence that victims of crucifixion in Judea were properly interred.
That's because we found a person who was properly buried, as far as I know. I don't know if he's going to make a reference to that.
In a tomb. There was an archaeological discovery of a man named Yehochanan, which still had the crucifixion nail in the ankles.
That's the one I'm thinking.
With a piece of wood from the cross affixed to it, because apparently the nail had hit a knot in the wood and bent so that it could not be extracted. And the fact that this was preserved shows that the body was put into a tomb where the flesh would decay, and then it was placed into an ossuary or bone box. Let me cite an important article from the New Testament scholar Craig Evans on the burial of Jesus that is relevant to this. He points out that in a recent publication, Bart Ehrman has embraced the dubious hypothesis of John Dominic Crossan that the body was left on the cross. Evans comments, I am not aware of any archaeologist or historian who accepts this quirky argument. Roman legal material explicitly states that the bodies of the executed, if request is made, can be taken down and given proper burial. And he references De Gesta, chapter 48.
So he's got documentation that is in support, legal documentation that is in support of taking bodies down crosses. That's pretty solid if you ask me, guys.
Our surviving literary evidence suggests that the bodies of those who were executed in and around Jerusalem during peacetime were not only permitted to be buried, but were expected to be buried before sundown on the day of death. This was done in order to preserve the purity of the land. Josephus, writing in the 70s, states that in his time, even the bodies of, quote, those sentenced to crucifixion are taken down and buried before sunset, end quote. That's from Jewish War, chapter 4, section 317. Because only Rome possessed capital power in Judea and Samaria in the time of Jesus, this means that those crucified by Roman authority were nevertheless permitted burial according to Jewish law and custom. Those executed or crucified were buried, and in fact, from the Jewish point of view, had to be buried to prevent the defilement of the land. Josephus remarks that during peacetime, the Romans did not require the Jewish people to violate their laws and customs. That's from Against Appian 2.73. And then he mentions the skeletal remains of Jehohanan, and he says these are not the only evidence for the proper burial of a victim of crucifixion. The remains of a man, both crucified and beheaded, were recovered from what is now called the Abba Cave, once again in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Givat HaMishtar. Nails were recovered from the ossuary. One nail was still embedded in the man's hand. So we have literary evidence as well.
Craig was like,
I have enough experience to handle you.
hey, by the way, I think like in regards to whatever the 39 minutes we watched this right here was the best segment because the references are there. Roman law is mentioned. Like, this is something very strong that Ehrman would have to respond to and say, well, no, I reject that. It wouldn't have happened in the case of Jesus, considering the evidence that's there. You got to respond to these historical documents. And for those of you guys who are sitting there and saying, no, it wouldn't have happened, and you're agreeing, the reality is that you need to look at those things and see whether it is or it is not the case for something like that to happen. I think that's very strong.
Well as archaeological evidence that in Judea during peacetime, the Romans respected the Jewish custom of immediate burial of crucified victims on the day of crucifixion.
Sorry, I've got a dog barking in the background. Someone just rang the doorbell. So if you hear some barking back there, just try not to pay too much attention to it. Try not to be too distracted. I actually wanted to pull up. Oh, we got a little bit of echo there. I wanted to pull up a scripture passage from Deuteronomy 21 verses 22 through 23, which supports this idea from Craig Evans that, well, let me just read it out here. So it says, and if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance.
By the way, the New Testament authors are very familiar with this, and they actually quote this passage, cursed is the man who's hung on a tree, about Jesus. So to say this is not in their psyche, this specific passage, would be just not honest intellectually.
And so that's like the Jewish custom of the day. That was,
Yes.
I believe the first time that I saw this was in the book that was co-authored by Craig Evans and N.T. Wright called Jesus the Last Days. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Really, really interesting verse, actually relevant to the whole debate here. So
Yes.
with that, let's go ahead and unless you've got anything else to add there, let's go ahead and jump to clip number 5. Okay, and clip number 5 is where he says, no other account exists of anyone being buried on an afternoon of crucifixion. Here we go.
I don't know of any instance where we have a verified account of anybody being buried on the afternoon of the crucifixion in a known tomb. So how likely is it that they made an exception in the case of Jesus? I mean, we think they would because, he's the Son of God, and so he's exceptional. But, I mean, Pilate didn't know that Jesus was the Son of God. He was just one of the guys who's crucifying that morning.
It's still quite an exceptional case. I mean, Pilate seems quite distressed at the fact that Jesus ends up going to...
According to whom?
To crucifixion. Well, according to the gospel
The
narrative.
Christian narrative.
But this is a
He
possibility.
crucified, it's possible. It's possible he's more upset about one of the other two guys.
If it is true that you have an instance of Pilate really not thinking that this man ought to be crucified and asking the crowds...
No, but I don't think that's historical. Why would we think that's historical?
I guess I'm not trying to make the case that it's that we can know that this is the case. But this might be an explanation as to why we do have an instance of the Romans making an exception when it comes to saluting someone on the cross. Because Jesus was exceptional, not just because he was the Son of God, because, of course, I don't believe that, and the Romans wouldn't have believed that, but that it was still an exceptional case.
Why?
I guess in the case of Pilate, this might have been someone who we really didn't think deserved to be crucified.
Why?
Because this would be the case if the gospel narratives are correct, if,
Yes.
if what's written there is correct.
That's right.
Again,
That's
I'm
right.
not claiming to be able to say that we know
No,
that they
no,
are, but if they were, this would offer an explanation of
That's
how we
right.
have an exception.
But the argument then is, if the gospel narratives are correct, then the gospel narratives are correct. And so that's not an argument.
Okay, so we've got here, no reason to think that Jesus is an exception to the rule, and then relying on Gospels for information about the burial account is circular.
Yeah.
What is your response?
As we just saw from the literary and archaeological evidence, Jesus was not the exception to the rule. Taking the bodies down and burying them on the day of crucifixion was the rule that was followed in Judea. Moreover, the reason that Jesus was treated that way, or the reason that we should think he was treated that way, is not because he was the Son of God. Rather, it's because we have very good reasons to believe that the burial narrative is credible. And it is evidence that has convinced virtually all scholars today. And that's not circular because we have good reasons to think that the gospel narratives about the burial are correct. Remember, I mentioned that we have multiple independent attestation in at least 5 different sources, some of which are among the earliest in the New Testament, such as the pre-Pauline formula quoted in 1 Corinthians 15 and the pre-Mark and Passion story. And this is one of the best tests of historicity, is to have multiple independent and early testimony to a particular event. Moreover, we saw that the burial of Jesus by a Jewish Sanhedrist is unlikely to be a Christian invention. This is the criterion of embarrassment at work. Something that would be an embarrassment to the early Christian movement is likely to be historical because it's unlikely to be made up. And for these reasons, the evidence in favor of Jesus' burial has convinced virtually all New Testament scholars.
So one thing that I wanted to sort of pick up on here is Bart seemed to, or Dr. Ehrman seemed to sort of appeal to an argument that, like, and this was one of the things that I was mentioning at the very beginning of the stream, where I was listening to him, listening to this interview, and I was just like, that is so wrong. That is so wrong. And it was when he was saying, well, you can't really trust it if it's in the Gospels, and you can't really trust that, right? Because it's circular. It's almost like you're trusting it because it's there, something along those lines. And so I wanted to just say that what you're doing, if you're reading the Gospels and you're believing it because it's in the Gospels, what you're doing is you're treating the Gospels as testimony, and that's a completely normal thing to do. So, like, suppose that you hear you're a juror in a court case, okay, and you hear, and all that's available is the testimony of someone who is sexually assaulted, and that's all the evidence that you have to go on. In that case, like, would it be circular to rely on the testimony of the person who is claiming that they were assaulted? No, that wouldn't be circular at all. You'd be relying on the testimonies. Testimony is a very well-known source of justification. You can actually go look that up in the Stanford Encyclopedia of the journal article on epistemology. You can look that up. Testimony is a valid source of justification.
I don't know why our society specifically, and when I say ours, I mean specifically in America, has such an issue with personal testimony. What's the problem? We view ourselves as so advanced scientifically, X, Y, and Z. Like, if you have reason to distrust personal testimony, that's something else. Personal testimony is a fact, I would say, of human knowledge. If my daughter right now, who's 7 years old, ran into this room right now and she said, "Dad, like X, Y, and Z and happened," I will not need any more information. I will not need any more evidence from her, and I will operate based on the information given to me by my daughter. She's a practical joker, by the way. She jokes quite a bit. She could be joking. She could, like, even with that evidence, I would still act on it. Even knowing that she practically jokes, I would still act on it because that would be the wise thing to do. Now, does that personal testimony has issues, obviously, right? Does that mean it comes to a point where we like withhold judgment? I don't necessarily think so. Right. Like these are the earliest, say, documents we have. And Ehrman says these are the earliest documents we have about Jesus. But we're just going to distrust them. And again, the reason why I'm saying these things is because I think at the end of the day, it's not the evidence that is leading Bart Ehrman to his conclusions. It's not the internal evidence that's leading him, say, not to believe in Christianity, not to believe in God existing. But it's rather a completely different subject that gets him to have those beliefs.
So this is not controversial in philosophy at all. So I think that this is also why it's super important, like before you come to conversations about evidence, it's important to have your epistemological grounding.
Amen.
And this is why philosophy is so important. You've got to know.
Cameron dropping bombs.
Epistemology, this is one of my sayings that I love. Epistemology covers a multitude of sins.
This is true.
Good epistemology covers a multitude of sins.
This is true.
If you have like a good epistemology, you're going to weed out a lot of like bad inferences and bad thoughts that you're going to have along the way.
Look at
when you're
Craig's
trying
smile.
to
He's
evaluate
like, yes.
a case like this. And so another thing I wanted to mention is Swinburne's principle of testimony. So what he says, what Richard Swinburne argues, is that when it comes to testimony, unless you just want to be a skeptic about basically everything that you hear from everyone, you've got to operate on the assumption that what you hear from other people is true unless you've got reason to doubt it.
Correct.
So basically you've got to work on the...
And even in those cases, like I just argued, even in those cases, it makes sense at times, even given the evidence that would make you distrust the individual that's in front of you, given what is at stake. It is more reasonable and rational for you to believe that rather than the other. So the example I give is if my daughter comes in here and tells me, hey, the house is on fire. I said, Lord Jesus, there's a fire, right? So the house is on fire. And I know she's a practical joker. My daughter plays jokes all the time. She finds it hilarious. She just cracks up when she does it. She's that sort of an individual. I know it to be the case. I would be more rational to act on that and go outside and check what's going on rather than say, oh, there you go again, joking and messing around, right? Because of what's at stake. Now, could be the case that she comes here and says, we have a little kiddie pool outside right now. She comes here and says, oh, the pool, just all the water from the pool spilled. And I'd be like, okay, like that's not a big deal. She's probably joking. Even if it did, it was like, so what? It's very important, guys. Epistemology matters.
Assumption that what you're hearing from people is accurate unless you've got a reason. So it's not to say that you just believe everything, but rather it's to say that you believe it on, with the clause, unless you've got sufficient reason to doubt it. Okay, so when someone's coming at the Gospels, they're reading it and they're saying, this just seems like this is what they were reporting they saw, and this is what happened. And I don't really have any reason to doubt this. And so I'm just going to believe this. And there's epistemologically zero wrong with that.
And with regard in particular to the burial of Jesus, Ehrman doesn't have any reason to think that this is not historical. All he can point to is general Roman practice outside of Judea, but doesn't draw the relevant comparisons in first century Israel.
So I suppose that Ehrman would have to go out of his way in that case and then respond to what Craig Evans had written about him in response with the evidences of extra biblical and beyond kind of the scope in regards to the laws, all the quotations again, like Ehrman would have to respond to that and negate them, not just respond to them, because respond to them is not enough, and say, no, even given that, we should not trust whatever the Bible says.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You've got to show that this is
Cameron.
what was going on in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even then, like, you're still relying. I mean, I haven't even really talked about this yet, but you're still at that point. You're still relying on the sort of frequentist interpretation of probability, where the probability of some event occurring in history is determined by how many times it happened elsewhere, or like how many trials of that event occurred in history. So like you might as well just argue that like most people don't rise from the dead, so Jesus didn't rise, and like that's your argument for why Jesus didn't rise back from the dead. Like just say that, like if that's ultimately what you want to say. Like you don't have to go through all of these different steps and deny all these different historical facts. Just say that. But apart from that, like a frequentist interpretation of probability is the wrong interpretation of probability. And I feel like we're kind of getting into some of the weeds here, but I think that's ultimately like we're getting into like the heart of the matter. And I think this is why, again, philosophy is so important, is because if you don't really know your philosophical assumptions going into it, then you're going to make inferences where you don't know the assumptions behind them. You don't know that what you're doing is you're assuming that frequencies are going to determine the probability of some historical event, whereas that is just in general the wrong way to go about determining probabilities. And so unless you've got anything else to add on that, we can go ahead and move on to
well,
number 6.
it recalls to mind an illustration that John Ehrman gives in the book you referred to, where scientists have been investing millions of dollars and thousands of man hours trying to detect an event of proton decay, and they have yet to do so. Well, on a frequency model of probability, it would therefore have a 0 chance of occurring, and all of those man hours and millions of dollars are being squandered for something that could never happen. And that's obviously absurd and shows that this frequency model of probability is simply wrong.
Right. And then it doesn't account for the fact that there can be anomalies. You can have some anomalous event occur even when most other things happen some other place. Some different thing happens in a different place, right? And so, and especially historical events like that, those sorts of things happen all the time, especially in different cultures where different things are allowed, right? So these are the sorts of these are the sorts of factors that you have to take into consideration when you're trying to do some sort of historical analysis. You've got to take in those cultural considerations. But then you've also just got to reject frequentism as an interpretation of probability. You got to get rid of that, and you got to lean on something like an inference to the best explanation, or you've got to lean on something like a Bayesian type view of probability. You've got to lean into something that's more respectable as an interpretation of probability. All right, let's get into clip number 6, and we're kind of running out of time, so we'll get through these as quickly as we can. So clip number 6 is what ultimately needs to be explained here.
Now, a moment ago you said that, okay, William Lane Craig is wrong because he says that we can know there's no tomb, and we can't. It seems to me a relatively minor detail in that you said, we have these 4 facts, including that Jesus was crucified, and including the groups of people claimed to have seen him after he died. You say,
I'm not sure groups of people claimed.
Okay, because this is what I wanted to pick up on when you said that this can be easily explained. What is it that you think can be explained? The fact that we have records of groups claiming to see Jesus, the fact that groups did actually claim to see Jesus, the fact that individuals claim to see Jesus. What are the things that you think, this isn't troubling for us to explain without having to invoke a resurrection?
I don't think it's troubling to invoke the idea that there were individuals who claimed they saw Jesus alive afterwards. I don't think we have good attestation for it. I think the Apostle Paul claims he saw Jesus alive a few years afterwards. And so I think, I don't think he's lying about it. I think he probably thought he saw Jesus.
Paul, also being our earliest source of the New Testament, claims at one point that Jesus appeared to 500 people.
That's right.
This seems to be some good evidence that we do have.
No, I don't think so. Paul knows there's a story that 500 people saw him. But I don't think that's evidence that 500 people saw him. That's a claim. And so a claim isn't evidence. Evidence is when you try to substantiate the claim. And so how do you go about establishing whether 500 people actually saw Jesus? Well, you look at what Paul says, and then you see are there other sources to corroborate it. Paul's writing before the Gospels. None of the Gospels mentions anything about this, or the Gospel sources. So Paul's our only source. And so is he right or not? Well, it seems like if 500 people saw him, that this would be something that other people would mention. So I don't think we know.
Yeah, so a good attestation.
By the way, that sort of seems weak. Because intention, like you're reading into intention now. If other people knew about this, they would mention it as well. Well, that's not necessarily true.
For appearances, there's no good attestation. Claim isn't evidence. Evidence is when you try to substantiate the claim. And then is there any evidence that corroborates the 500 claim?
Yeah, here we move now from a discussion of the empty tomb and burial to a discussion of the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And the fact is that the appearances of Jesus alive after his death that are listed by Paul in this very old tradition that he hands on in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 show that these resurrection appearances to different individuals and groups are multiply attested. And the most significant group appearance would be to the 12, which is attested not only in the old tradition delivered by Paul and vouched for by him who had personal contact with the 12, but is also found in the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Luke. Now, what about the 500 brethren that Paul mentions? I think that the footnote that Paul adds, so to speak, to this resurrection appearance is significant. He says he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time. And then he says, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep, that is, have died. Now, what this shows is that Paul was familiar with who these people were. He knew that some of them had died in the interim, but that most of these people were still about. And Paul is saying, in effect, the witnesses are there.
Look, the reality is that these are the sort of things that are very important to pay attention to because they're very unnecessary if you're making something up. I don't know whether you have ever lied in your life. I suspect that every single one of us have lied at one point or another. And I suspect there are lies that we have said that we've gotten away with. But I also suspect there are lies that we said that we didn't get away with, probably when we were much younger. I would almost guarantee that the lies that you did not get away with are lies where you gave too much information. So, you could have lied when you were younger or whatever, maybe, recently. Maybe you didn't want someone to know who you were out with or where you were going or something. Or you didn't even go out, you just said, hey, we went out. And you said, oh yeah, I went out with my friend. And you named the friend. And then your mom goes, oh, I know that guy. Let me call him and see. Or, hey, mom, I'm going out with so-and-so. That's a better one. Hey, mom, I'm going out with so-and-so. But you're going out with a completely different group of people. Going to a party or something. So your mom calls up that person or calls their parents and goes, hey, is so-and-so home? Oh, yeah, they're in their bed. They're sleeping. Oh. Interesting. Been caught. A better lie would be, hey, mom, I'm going out with friends. So she calls so-and-so's mom. Hey, so-and-so at home? Yeah, he's asleep. Mom calls you up and goes, hey, I just talked to so-and-so's mom, and he's sleeping at home. Oh, I thought that you were out with him. And you go, Mom, I never said I was out with him. But you said you were out with your friends. But correct, I am out with my friends. Right? You see the way this goes. Why say stuff like that? Why fill in these details if you're lying? Why say, hey, some of these people are still alive? You don't need to. Are my eyes deceiving me, or am I... moving around too much. Hello. Come back. There we are. Right, you don't need to. You really don't need to. I had a friend that would lie like this all the time, by the way. I had this friend when I was in high school. He would always speak in generalities. He was like, you could say he was a compulsive liar. He would always speak in these generalities. And you wouldn't be able to pin him down because he knew how to lie well. Once you start giving specifics, you can get caught. So if Paul is lying about these 500 people, why say some of them are still alive? Why not say 500 people saw him resurrected from the dead? Sad to report that all of them have died. Okay. So again, let's address this because I think this is a good point. Who said Paul is lying? Okay, well, he's making it up. According to what Bart Ehrman said, is if other people knew about this, they would have said it. But what is the? If other gospel authors knew about this, they would have said it, but they didn't say it. What does that mean? Paul's making this up. Let's just take your reasoning. It could have been that Paul heard about the 500. It doesn't make it true, nor does it make it false. We don't have any access to verify or falsify the 500. We don't have access to that. But his original audience had access to that because he says that some of these people are still alive. The conversation is not about whether we have access to it. The conversation is about whether other people had access to it. The other thing is that even if this is something that's made up by Paul, other disciples would have called him out and said, hey, man, you're talking nonsense here. This didn't happen. I've always been a fan of the counter argument. Like, why ever argue that Jesus resurrected from the dead physically? You could always come up with a better lie. If you're making a story up, say, like, you would have to be, by the way, you would have to be, if Jesus didn't physically resurrect from the dead, mass hallucination is not a thing. That is not a good enough theory. And the only other option there would be the disciples made it up. Now you got to do intent of the disciples making it up. I don't know, they got to get something out of it. What did they get out of it? Doesn't seem like they got much out of it. And then all these things end up being lies. It doesn't make sense to go with this kind of a reasoning. Why would Paul say some of these people are still alive? Just don't say anything. Even if he heard it, like, hey, I heard 500 people witnessed him resurrect from the dead. That's just not the way this stuff is written. Secular scholars don't say the gospel writers lied. They say that it's sacred history. Whatever that means, by the way. Secular scholars have come up with a category of things to stick stuff into. It's sacred history. No, either they were mistaken, they lied, or it's true. Like, you can call it whatever you want. Oh, they really believed it. Well, was it really true? But no. They really believed Jesus came back from the dead. Is it really true? Did it really happen? No, it didn't really happen. So they're wrong. It didn't really happen. Even if they believed it was true, it didn't really happen. Correct. I mean, this is just like semantics to a certain extent. Historical religious fiction. Correct. It's made up. Fiction. Made up stuff. Oh, but they really believed it. It doesn't matter. It's made up stuff. The original folks who made it up knew it was made up stuff. And I would just say there's better stuff to make up. There's easier stuff to make up if you're making up stuff. Do yourself a favor and watch back the stream listening to the crackle on your voice. Last time I'll mention this. Okay. I don't hear any crackles right now. I know earlier on the stuff you read, unless my threshold gate when it comes to the mic, something's up. So I don't know what's. Thank you, appreciate it, by the way, Paul.
The listing of witnesses was the most important attestation of historicity in the ancient world. And this is the procedure that Paul uses of listing the witnesses to the resurrection appearances. And he notes of the 1 to the 500 that most of them are still about at the time of his writing to the Corinthians in AD 55. Now, this appearance could well be mentioned in the Gospels. It could be the mountaintop appearance in the 28th chapter of Matthew on the mountain in Galilee. This is the only resurrection appearance that was by appointment. The disciples went to the mountain where Jesus had appointed to meet them. And you remember it was in Galilee that thousands had flocked to hear Jesus give the Sermon on the Mount and to teach the crowds. And I think it's not at all improbable that 500 brethren might have gathered on that mount in Galilee where they witnessed that resurrection appearance that Paul refers to in this old tradition.
So one thing that I wanted to point out, and I've made a whole video about this, is when he says that claim is not evidence, I think that's honestly just silly. Like it's not something that we should take seriously. If my daughter came home one day and was like, "Daddy, someone hit me at school today,"
Yeah, he's got a daughter too.
I would take that seriously. I would be calling the school. I'd try to figure out what happened. Like I would take that as very good evidence that something happened and that she was hit. I would take her claim as very good evidence. And so I think it's just honestly bonkers that someone could say that, a claim is not evidence. But then it seems like he wants to say that a claim, like one person's claim is not evidence, but if you have a whole bunch of claims from different people, then that's evidence. Which, if that's his standard, then I think in the case of Dr. Craig's case, each of the facts that he mentions do have, like multiple attestation is in place for these facts.
Oh, yeah.
For
Yes.
the empty, for the burial, for the empty tomb, for the appearances, we've got multiple attestation. So I think Bart Ehrman would have to admit that we got evidence for each of these facts. So I think that, go ahead.
Well, I was agreeing and wanted to say that the comparison with figures like Romulus is fatuous. There is nothing comparable to the resurrection appearances in antiquity. And this has been demonstrated authoritatively by the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright in this massive book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. This is a treasure trove of ancient source material, pagan and Jewish, on appearances after death and resurrection and so forth. And what Wright shows is that there's nothing in either ancient paganism or Judaism comparable to the resurrection appearances of Jesus. Pagans believed that death was a one-way street, and therefore people did not come back from the dead. Now, certainly, pagans believed that you might see a ghost or you might see a vision of a dead person. But as Wright points out, for the ancient pagan, seeing a vision of a dead person was not evidence that he was alive. It was evidence that he was dead.
Correct.
Now, for Jews, by contrast, they believed in resurrection of the dead, but not within history. The resurrection of the dead was a corporate event that always occurred after the end of the world on Judgment Day, when the dead would be raised and God would judge people for what they had done in the earthly life. And so these resurrection appearances of Jesus are incomparable to what you find in the literature of antiquity in both paganism and Judaism.
Well, Dr. Craig, we're at about the hour mark. Unless you're burning to get to the last two clips, why don't we go ahead and end it there? I feel like this is a good place to end it.
I am happy to continue if you've got the time in view of the importance of these things. But if you need to cut it off, I understand.
No, I don't. I was just. I'd like to respect your time. So no, but yeah, let's keep on going. So we've got 2 more clips, as I mentioned. So here's clip number 7. Clip number 7 is, what is the explanation then for the facts surrounding Jesus? And so then Dr. Ehrman gives his explanation of what happened.
And what is the most likely explanation in your view for these facts? What do you think happened? Is someone lying? Is someone mistaken?
No, I don't think anybody's lying.
Okay,
This whole thing.
so I'm very interested in this conversation now. I haven't watched this, by the way. So I really want to know what's going on in his mind.
I just think, I think a lot of atheists have this kind of binary, right? If it didn't happen, then somebody's lying about it. And that's just crazy. I mean, all of us have stories told about us that are not necessarily, sometimes we have people lying about us, but sometimes people just don't know any better. I mean, William Lane Craig thinks that I was trained as a textual critic. He honestly thinks that. He's not lying about it. He just doesn't know. I wasn't trained as a textual critic. So he doesn't know that. So people don't necessarily lie. I think in the case of the stories about Jesus, I think my opinion is that the most plausible explanation is this. We have, we know that Paul says that he saw him, and I don't think Paul's lying about it. I think Paul saw something. He thought he saw Jesus 3 years afterwards. We have pretty good evidence to suggest that Peter was claiming that he saw Jesus. I mean, he's Paul.
Okay, so those things require explanations, by the way, because that's a claim now. So he thinks it's true that Paul saw Jesus. Is it a hallucination? Is it a dream? Why would he believe that? Why would he put his life at risk and change his entire existence around? That needs an explanation. Now, it even becomes more difficult when you say Peter saw him too. Now you got 2 people having the same experience. So now you got to explain Peter's experience and Paul's experience separately, and then you got to explain their experiences together of how that's possible. And there's just 2 people. Consider adding 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 people.
Paul says he was the first to see Jesus, and in the gospel accounts, he's one of the early. He's there. Mary Magdalene. I would suppose Mary Magdalene probably had some kind of vision of Jesus. My sense is that these 3 people independently saw something they interpreted to be Jesus. They maybe had a vision of some sort. They mistook an identity. They had a dream. I don't know. Something happened to them, each of them, and they told others, who told others, who told others, and the story's propagated.
Yeah. So this is interesting because what we get is
but they include individuals in their experiences. So it's not Peter had this, Mary Magdalene had that, Paul had that. It's at various points, collectively, the 12 had that. You got to be fair in that conversation.
like his explanation of what allegedly actually happened, right? So he's got Paul, Peter, and Mary Magdalene experience individual appearances of Jesus through visions, dreams, or mistaken identity. They then told others, who told others, who told others, who told others, and then that became the Christian story. It's remarkable. It's remarkable that people believe this stuff. I don't know. I don't want to try, I don't want it to come across as belittling Dr. Ehrman or anything like that. It's remarkable to me that people can come up with these explanations and then think that they're plausible.
Yeah. There is no doubt that these appearances of Jesus did occur. Even Ehrman himself concedes that there were individuals who saw post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And this would include appearance to the 12, the group of the 12 disciples. This is the best attested of the resurrection appearances. So the question is, how can they best be explained? Can these appearances be explained psychologically in some way? Well, here I think the difficulty is that these appearances and the explanation they gave for them contradicted Jewish beliefs in 2 fundamental respects.
This is a good point.
First of all, Jews believed that the resurrection of the dead was only a corporate event, not the resurrection of an isolated individual apart from the rest of the people. And secondly, they believed that the resurrection only occurred after the end of the world. So even if the disciples had had visions of Jesus, much less dreams, they would not have preached that he was resurrected from the dead.
Correct, because they would have had a historical setting and a religious setting for visions. You got Isaiah, who has a vision. You have Ezekiel, who has a vision. Visions are a part of the Old Testament narrative. And if the disciples are arguing in this sense, in this religious, historical, whatever context, they would have spoken about it as a vision. That is more plausible. That is more likely to be the case rather than them going around saying, hey, we had this vision of Jesus. So Paul's experience is a vision, by the way, on the road to Emmaus, as opposed to the 12 who actually see him. But the reason why Paul, I think, understands his vision to be true is because these guys are actually saying he physically resurrected from the dead. Where it doesn't stop at it just being a vision.
At most, they would have said that he was assumed into heaven. This is an entirely different category in Jewish thinking than resurrection of the dead.
Correct.
The assumption of someone into heaven is the snatching away of someone out of the space-time world into the heavenly realm.
Elijah.
A resurrection is the raising up of the dead man, the corpse, to life in the spatio-temporal world. And the origin of the Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection requires some sort of explanation for why the disciples came to believe that he was risen from the dead on the basis of these appearances and empty tomb, rather than had simply been assumed into heaven.
What about...
Or if they had a vision, they already had a category of visions. You guys, I can't deny the fact, and I can't get past the fact that if this is a part of the religious story, and they think they are a part of the religious story of the Old Testament, why create new categories? So here's what we're saying, essentially. Come on. Hello, camera. Man, I move too much. Essentially, here's what we're saying. These people said they didn't have visions, but what we're going to say is they had visions. They didn't know what they were talking about. Even though they had categories of visions. And they could have said it's a vision because previous people to them had visions and said they had visions. And they knew how to distinguish between what a vision is. They knew what resurrection was, and it was out of time for them, belief-wise, to believe in a resurrection and to argue that somebody had resurrected from the dead physically. Even though that is something that is still to happen in their minds at the end of the world when people are judged. But then somebody like Bart Ehrman says, notice he doesn't deny, like a lot of atheists deny, even the experience. He doesn't deny the experience of them having visions and stuff. What he denies is, what Bart Ehrman really denies is that these experiences, even though being real to them, were not actual experiences. So he validates their experiences, but he says they're not what you thought they were. And other than having a preset, preconceived conclusion on this, he has no way of arguing for that in my mind. It's just impossible.
Mistaken identity. Again, I'm just like, I'm thinking about
like they
this as a
accidentally saw
possible
someone.
explanation. I just can't
I agree, Cameron.
even take
That's
it seriously. But
Incredible for the overwhelming, numinous quality that these appearances evidently had that was so life-changing for these disciples. Remember when
well, like take Peter. Yeah, I mean, Peter was his chief disciple. Like, this guy's the one who, like, maybe he saw him in a crowd or something, and like he thought he was returned from the dead, or did he go talk to him? Did he?
Yeah, that's not credible. No one, I think, believes that that would be a credible explanation of these appearances, because it doesn't take seriously how devastating the crucifixion of Jesus was for these people. They had pinned their hopes on Jesus as the Messiah, and Judaism had no idea of a Messiah who, rather than triumphing over the enemies of Israel and establishing David's throne in Jerusalem, would be brutally crucified, humiliated, and killed by his enemies. That was simply unthinkable in Judaism, nor was there any idea that Messiah would be raised from the dead. Those ideas just weren't connected at all. And therefore, the disciples were absolutely devastated by this event. It put a question mark behind everything they believed. And so these appearances had to be incredibly powerful, overwhelming events in order to transform the lives of the disciples and lead them to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. Now, psychological visions, hallucinations could indeed be very powerful, but as I've just explained, they would not lead to belief in Jesus' resurrection, because that contradicted fundamental Jewish beliefs in at least two respects. Rather, given their Jewish first century mindset, visions of Jesus after his death would have led them at most to believe that Jesus had been assumed into heaven, glorified, and that is where they saw him. And that would cause them to look forward to the end of the world and the judgment at the last day, when they and all the righteous dead of Israel would be united in the kingdom of God. But it would not lead them to proclaim that he was already risen from the dead, contrary to Jewish beliefs.
So now, on the nature of the appearances, it seems like this is maybe an area where you would differ from, say, the work of Mike Licona and Gary Habermas, where they're going to appeal to facts that are sort of minimal, right? Where they're not going to get into much detail about the nature of the appearances. Whereas you, it seems like you want to say that, you know, we know from the nature of the appearances in the Gospels that they were very tangible, very physical. And would you include some of those facts from what we learned from the Gospels in your case?
I do think that we have good evidence that these were not merely visionary experiences, that is, say, subjective, intramental experiences, but that they were extramental experiences of an objective reality in the real world. And I say that not only on the basis of the gospel evidence, but also on the basis of Paul's evidence concerning his teaching about the nature of the resurrection body. The strategy of those who are skeptical of physical appearances is to try to drive a wedge between Paul and the Gospels with respect to the physicality of the appearances. And I think that wedge strategy can be decisively refuted. Paul believed in a physical resurrection body and therefore physical resurrection appearances just as much as those portrayed in the Gospels.
What is the evidence that Paul believed that Jesus had a resurrected body as opposed to a resuscitated body?
Well, it would be the lines in the narrative that says that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and he was buried, and then he appeared on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. The death and burial of Jesus are central to this early tradition that Paul hands on. And the appearances or that he appeared to the disciples, that requires then the fact of the empty tomb. So I think that given Paul's belief in the death of Christ, which he affirms over and over again it's clear that he believed in Jesus' resurrection rather than just that he was resuscitated.
Because of the
I take it that you mean a return from someone who is apparently dead, but then they're brought back to life somehow.
Yeah, and that could also be over the course of a couple days. So like someone could be dead
Like
a
Lazarus.
couple days and then come back to
First
life.
Corinthians 15 goes on to teach about the glory and incorruptibility and immortality of the resurrection body. He has the same sort of doctrine of glorified resurrection bodies that you typically find in Judaism. So he describes the resurrection body as spirit-directed, immortal, incorruptible, and powerful and glorious, which is not a return to the earthly life, but a transformation of the body to a new mode of existence.
And in context, that happens immediately after the beginning of chapter 15. It happens immediately after talking about Jesus's resurrection.
Yes, you see, the reason that he recounts this early tradition to prove that Jesus rose from the dead is because there were people in Corinth denying the eschatological at the end of the world. For what reason, we don't know, but they didn't believe in the resurrection at the last day. And so what Paul wants to say is that if Christ has not been raised, then the dead are not raised. And yet Christ has been raised. And this is our guarantee that we too will someday be raised from the dead.
And so then the whole question is, what does it mean to be raised? What does it mean to be raised? And then he's describing what it means to be raised in 15.
In graphic
in 15.
terms.
Right. All right. Let's move on to clip number 8. This is our last clip for today's stream. This has been so much fun. I've really enjoyed this stream today. And as you say, this is a really important topic. So I'm really appreciative of you coming on to do this with me today. So here's clip number 8. Here we go.
This kind of thing happens all the time.
And so when you get both the Synoptic Gospels, and the Gospel of John, but I guess not in Mark, but you do get a sort of an anticipation of a group appearance in Mark at the end of Mark, but 2 of the Synoptic Gospels and in John, when we have a sort of written account of a group of people physically in a room seeing the figure of Jesus. Is this just a story that sort of develops out of nowhere? I mean, if this event didn't occur, but shows up in all of these Gospels.
It doesn't occur out of nowhere. It occurs because people are saying, I've seen Jesus.
But if you think it's plausible that individuals might have seen Jesus,
yes,
and maybe there are some sort of ideas floating around that, this person thought they saw Jesus, this person thought they saw Jesus, but the idea of a group of disciples sort of all getting together in a room, some of them saying that they've seen Jesus, and Jesus appearing to sort of vindicate his resurrection to them. Is this the sort of thing that can just sort of develop? Is this sort
Absolutely.
of like a...
How do rumors start anyway? I mean, how do rumors start that, 1,000 people saw this thing? 20 people saw this UFO. Well, where does that come from? It's not that somebody's lying about it, and it's usually not that 20 people saw it. So it just happens. That kind of thing happens when you tell stories. But I want to insist that we don't have any of these group members saying that it happened. The other thing we haven't pointed out is you can't just take the Gospels at face value for this, because when you compare their narratives of the resurrection, they're more contradictory than the stories of the birth narratives. We don't have a consistent independent narrative. What we have are independent narratives that contradict each other, that are all written 40, 50, 60 years later by people living in a different part of the world who didn't know any eyewitnesses, who aren't even speaking the same language. I mean, so what do historians do with sources like that? They don't simply accept what they say because they happen to agree with their religious views. They evaluate them in light of what we know at the time, their consistency, even though if they collaborated with each other. These are the kinds of things that historians do. When you do that with these sources, I just don't think that you make a compelling case.
Okay, so yeah, so to quickly summarize there, how does anything get made up? And he says this thing kind of happens when you tell stories. We don't have any of these group members saying that it actually happened. And then you can't take the Gospels at face value because when you compare the accounts, they're contradictory. And then as historians, we've got to figure out what actually happened.
Yeah, he's certainly right that historians don't just take it at face value, but they will explore the credibility of the accounts that we have. And when they do that with regard to the Gospels, as I say, we have multiple independent attestation, not only of these various appearances, such as to the 12, but also of the honorable burial and the empty tomb of Jesus. And for that reason, Ehrman is an outsider with respect to what most New Testament historians believe about these facts. As for the so-called contradictions, what these concern are minor secondary details in the narratives. It doesn't touch the historical core, which is what I've described in our podcast today in talking about these 4 events. So while there may be differences among the narratives and the circumstantial details, the historical core of the traditions is remarkably consistent and is multiply and independently attested in extremely early sources that go back to within the first decade after Jesus' crucifixion.
When I heard this, I was thinking, like, imagine, again, going back to like a court case example, imagine you have 2 witnesses and both of them tell stories that mostly line up, but then they have like contradictions in the secondary or minor details. And then you hear that and you realize, okay, well, actually, this person says that the lights were on, this person says that the lights were off. They both saw the same person run out, but the lights, there's a situation with the lights. Like, would you throw out all the testimony at that point? No, you wouldn't throw out the testimony. You wouldn't just be like, okay, both these guys are unreliable. Let's get rid of these guys. Let's just rely on other evidence, or just throw it all out. Like if that was the only evidence that we had, like suppose that the cameras weren't working at that time. Like it's just remarkable again to me that you would just disregard everything just because you find a
Cameron, what you're looking for is a certain kind of skepticism that some people have. And so therefore, that's the direction they're going to go into. It's just the reality of it.
Couple contradictions like that. That's the option that you go to. It just strikes me as it's just odd.
It occurs to me, Cameron, that in one sense, Ehrman has never really shed his fundamentalist upbringing. He still seems to have the idea that the exposure of one inconsistency or one contradiction in the narratives leads you to throw the whole thing out and calls everything into question. And he ought to know that's not the way historians work.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. But so as we wrap up the show today, that's all the clips that we've got. Is there anything that you'd like to say about the clip overall as we sort of wrap everything up?
Just that I think that Ehrman does a great job of calmly and confidently presenting his aberrant views so that unsuspecting laymen could well be deceived by what he's saying. And I hope that folks have been able to see that credible scholars like N.T. Wright and others that I've referred to have a quite different view of the matter than does Bart Ehrman. He is an outsider. He's in the tiny minority in denying things like the burial and empty tomb of Jesus and the appearances to groups. And I hope folks will not be deceived by what he's saying.
Well, thank you, Dr. Craig, for joining me today. Thank you guys for joining me. Thank you for watching.
Well, thank you, Cameron, for doing this. Appreciate it, man. Really do. And thank you, Dr. Craig, as always, for sharing and speaking into people's lives with all this stuff. Appreciate it. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed that reaction time, guys.